So today, childhood and adolescent development. I don't know how many of you got the chance to read the two readings. It was a little lighter this week from the directory on catechesis and also the Sophia Cavalletti reading. And I would say I was telling Father Seamus this. It's kind of a tricky subject to find good readings on in a certain way. And we'll talk about that a little bit of some of the challenges and ways that I think this topic is still really growing. It's a little bit different from some of our others where we can go back and be like, oh, well, the church fathers said this. But some of it is an area that I think maybe some of us will work, towards and in our kind of practice of teaching the faith, also learn from that. So we're focusing mainly on teaching young people in this session. And I think a good way to look at these next few weeks, we switched around a few. So Father Augustine will be teaching on spirituality and prayer and personal spiritual development. But these next few weeks are pretty practical. And so hopefully what we've learned has set kind of a foundation of, the content of what are some of the basics, the foundations of our faith. And then this is more practical of how to consider teaching it and conveying it in a way that will be effective, or as effective as it can be. We'll be learning. So it's not going to be completely like psychological stages of development. We will look a little bit at that, but really of how our understanding of the growth of the human person relates to how we convey our faith and teach the greatest mysteries of our faith to people of all different ages. G.K. Chesterton has this quote that I really love. He says, "The one eternal education is this, to be sure enough that something is true that you dare to tell it to a child." And I always thought that was a really beautiful quote, to be sure enough that something is true, to dare to tell it to a child. So when we're telling a child something then, or we're teaching, there's some challenges that come up in that, of course. And I think one of them that I've been reflecting on, even as I was trying to look into these readings and prepare this talk, is that it really goes into every realm of the human person, the development of someone. So psychologically, social, physically, we know that things aren't divided, compartmentalized in a human person and divided out. So how they develop spiritually and religiously is related in some ways to this. And even in a completely secular point of view, without regard to religious education and catechesis, there's a lot of unknowns. So we have research psychologists and developmental psychologists who have different theories on education. And education, at least, and in some ways this scope is going to be a little bit limited to our culture and our country as well, but at least here our way of education, we try to have it informed by some of these stages of development, but there's a lot of areas that there's still some work to be done. The study of developmental psychology in a more formal research way really started at the end of the 19th century. And some of it was empirical, and some of it was, philosophers who also were kind of theorizing about the development of people. So I know, and I think Father Seamus has mentioned Locke and Rousseau a little bit, but John Locke was someone who started to kind of theorize, and he was the one who said children had a blank slate, tabula rasa. They came from a blank slate, and anything that was a part of their development and formation going forward then was environmental, what they had as an outside influence. So we know that that's not in accord with our faith, with our understanding of original sin and how we're not just born with a blank slate. Then Rousseau didn't buy the blank slate type of thing. He saw development more of these like general stages, but he had a bit of that hands-off approach, right? That a child should be led to have their inner instincts and self be brought out and not have too much outside influence in their development. Freud, we won't go too much into Freud. This will be like a very general survey of some of these psychologists, but Freud really dominated a lot of the psychological study up until the 1950s. Then they made more of a shift to more behavioral sciences, because a lot of his, he studied the unconscious and these instincts, impulses, but a lot of what his theories weren't really founded in anything that could be proven necessarily, right? Later on, I think the most popular than child psychologist, which some of you may have heard of, is Piaget, who is from Switzerland. And he was in the late 20th century, and he kind of started these, which became very popular and famous in the world of developmental psychology, these tests on different age groups. And he would present them with situations and problems. And he would see that children in these different age brackets would consistently get questions wrong or misunderstand a situation. So one of the famous ones of these is when he would take like two different size containers, and like one would be a tall, larger looking one would be a low, smaller looking one. He would pour the same amount of water. They would see him pouring it into there. But the children, mostly under 6 years old or thereabouts, wouldn't understand that there was the same amount of water in each vessel because the vessels were different. So he used different experiments like this and started to come up with things that typically at a certain age wouldn't be comprehensible, or it wouldn't be as understandable for a child at that age. So he came up with 4 different stages. The first being a lot about sensory. We know this, how the brain kind of develops it is sensory. Then we have language added onto it. Then we have higher cognitive function. So he came up with these 4 stages. I won't get too far into them. They're kind of vaguely used in some ways, I think, in the educational world, but all of these theories are open to criticism, and they had a lot of criticism. So the first stage he described as the sensory motor up until the age of about 2. So children learning by touch, by sight, grabbing things, putting them in their mouth, throwing things. And then from about like 2 to 6 years old, an increase in their development that he called pre-operational. So they would start to be able to understand that objects represented certain things, but they would still have a hard time imagining other points of views. They would fixate usually on one aspect of something. The concrete operational stage, he theorized, was about 6 to 12 years old, where they could start to think logically and also see beyond their own perspective. And then the last stage he wrote about was the formal operational stage, which was 12 and older, which included abstract thinking and beyond. So those are a few. There was plenty of other psychologists that have tried to develop more in the field. One that I thought was interesting was Erik Erikson. He actually described stages in terms of conflicts. So from 1 year and under, he would say there's a trust versus mistrust conflict. From 1 to 3, there's an autonomy versus doubt conflict. From 7 to 11 years old, there was industry when children enter school versus inferiority. 12 to 18, identity versus confusion, and then so on. And he actually integrated the virtues into each of these stages, interestingly. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of like the secular psychological view of it. And you might have caught this a little bit in the directory for catechesis, where they encourage, the catechesis should be informed by the understanding of the whole person. So having our, what we can observe, science being the observation of what reality is of the world God created, having that inform our principles of how to teach and what children might be able to understand. It's not as concrete in these stages, is something that is important because it informs how we would be able to convey some of these things that we might be able to explain to an adult, but would be a lot harder actually to explain to a kid. I find this sometimes. People are like, oh, it must be so much harder to teach adults. And I think it's actually the opposite in many ways, that actually to know something really completely, to teach without error, and know the nuances of something, to simplify it and then teach it at an appropriate level to a different age is actually very challenging. Rather than you're teaching someone who, as an adult, hopefully has developed more of that reason, and you can explain it to them in a little bit of more in-depth way. So there's a lot kind of to these nuances. One thing also, as I'm kind of talking about why it's a little challenging to figure out some of this, is the development of technology too. A lot of our understanding and research about childhood and adolescent development was done in a time when there wasn't the same technological advancements we have today. So even in these last 15 years, which we don't even know the extent to how much that has changed the development of our children. There's a kind of popular psychologist now, Jean Twenge, who has been writing about this a bit. And it's even more ominous than people think sometimes at the surface level, because a lot of times we think about the development of children's brains and being short-circuited and attention spans. But there's some really kind of startling implications of how technology might be impacting the development of children, with depression, a whole slew of things that seems to be really rapidly at rise and very relevant to a learning environment for children. Because if you think of all of these other factors that are going on, it's not, it's very relevant. So there's a little bit of this psychological cognitive background, and we'll walk through these different stages, these different ages, and talk a little bit about some of these more common things to find in the stages. But just for a little bit of background then on where that came from and how in some ways we need to just be discerning about it. We know, and even scientifically and without a perspective of faith, from a secular point of view, a lot of these things have holes. That's kind of how it goes with a lot of science, because it's about observation and learning things. We think that there's the reality of the child developing, but we know that we're not going to understand all of it. So how does this impact us as a church then? We have some scientific or kind of hypothetical research that has been done about children. And as a church now, as we approach catechesis, how do we kind of navigate that? And we know that there's a lot of hope because we have saints, great saints, and others who are able to educate very effectively. But I would say, Father kind of mentioned this last week too. He's like, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was kind of implying that it's a time to take risks too and learn more, because some of what has been done in catechesis and in teaching has not worked. And so kind of seeing how we can continue to learn from our understanding of the human person and then continue to see how to teach. And this is kind of clear for us. We look at curriculums for, K through 12th grade, and none of them are ideal. that we found. It's basically pick the least bad one, the one that's like gets by. We haven't found one yet from all the ones that we've been going through that it's like, oh yeah, that's great. The one we have now is all right. It's pretty comprehensive, but there's still things that I'm like, why did they do that? Like, I was just looking at one, we were getting our textbooks back from our teachers who just taught this past academic year. And it was teaching about the Eucharist, and it was like, what type of bread is this? And it like showed a hamburger bun. And like, what type of bread is this? And it showed a hot dog bun. And like, how do you eat it? And it was like, it kind of went nowhere. And I was like, what is that? Like, you kind of look at some of this stuff and you're like, where did people get this? So it's not like there's, a ton. I think there's definitely movements, or not movements, but groups like Word on Fire with Bishop Barron and some others that are really trying hard to kind of develop material that is age appropriate and is good. But it is a challenge to find this stuff. So it's not, that door's locked. So it's not like there's a ton, of resources that you're like, yes, they should follow that exactly. For our catechists that are currently teaching K through 12, we do tell them, though, to follow the book to an extent. Because, and that's obviously with good judgment and exception, but the problem that we found is that if you don't follow the book, you become like you don't have anything to kind of guide you, and you're just sharing this things that maybe you have a proclivity to, the things you've maybe taught before, and then it becomes something that the kid maybe has heard this 3 years in a row now, and they haven't learned something that's actually comprehensive. So at least the way that curriculums are set up now for teaching children have like a comprehensive breadth of like, okay, they're going to learn this about salvation history, learn this about the sacraments. And if you kind of follow the topics, then they'll actually learn, a little, not just a little narrow niche of the faith. So we do tell them to, yeah, Kelly?
Just out of curiosity,
yeah.
Can I ask which curriculum?
Yeah, we use Sophia Press, Sophia Institute. Are you familiar with?
I've heard.
Okay.
Heard
Yeah. Yeah, they have a few lines of, we use the Spirit of Truth track. At least for our K through 8. I will say the curriculum for the high school is great. The Midwest Theological Institute, I think they're excellent. I would get behind those books and be like, that is a great book. So there's different options out there, and there's, for a lot of these age groups then, when you have a catechist, they, as much as they're supposed to follow the book, make it comprehensive, there's also a judgment of like how much and what is the main purpose of what to convey to a child at a specific age group. And that could be, sometimes this happens, and I don't want to say anything bad about teachers, but sometimes it's a shift for teachers then who come and teach at the program, at the K through 12 program, because they're like, well, I need to, in my class, get through this, and make sure that like they get through that material, memorize this. But in catechesis, it's like, okay, it's not about how much we can crunch into this lesson if they don't understand it. And some of the books don't always lend itself to this. Like, we had our fifth grade class, I was filling in for one of the teachers that was out, and it like went from like the Annunciation to the Eucharist to the scriptural rosary and like a bunch of other stuff in one lesson. And I was like, what? Even an adult would be like, my head is spinning after this. So there's a certain, like prudence and judgment that people need to make, and like, okay, well, what is the main focus of this lesson? And anyway, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent with that. But kind of seeing for the lesson, what are the objectives, not just building it around, okay, what material do we need to kind of like crunch into this? This happened too with our second year students, second year of sacrament prep, who were preparing to receive confirmation and First Holy Communion. They had a lesson on, well, they had many lessons on the Eucharist, but it's the year that they're supposed to really, really know what the Eucharist is, you know? And the lesson, I was sitting in the back of the classroom watching the catechists teach, and it was like, well, what's the vessel? And then it went to the monstrance and adoration. And it was like the kids were confused. They're like, well, how does that relate to what I'm preparing to receive? They couldn't connect it, and it was very abstract. So there's some things that it's like, okay, well, there's a difference between learning material or vocabulary and all that and actually understanding how it connects to the sacramental life of the faith. So anyway, that's an area where, there's some discernment and shifting, and hopefully there's more and more people like you guys who kind of have a foundation in the faith that are like, oh no, I feel confident knowing not just the list of things, but what to prioritize and what to emphasize more to people. That, okay, if the kid like knows a ton about this like really small thing, but doesn't understand the big picture, then we didn't really convey the faith well, because we didn't prioritize and like give an order of what we're communicating. Okay. I went a little bit off, but so we're going to get into kind of practical breakdown of ages, of what is kind of typical for different ages. And then I want to talk about some specific topics and how we would teach them to different groups. As I said before, though, something to keep in mind with all of this is that the first part of it, which you all have been working on, is actually knowing the faith. And not just knowing it, but being changed by it, being affected by it. Pope Paul VI has this quote about that people listen to witnesses more than teachers. So that's a reason for this course too. If you're a witness first and then a teacher, that's better because you're going to have some more credibility there. One thing too, and I'm going back a little bit, but this I think comes up again and again, is with our understanding and kind of influence of the outside world, making sure that what we're trying to do and like what we think is like a great idea and new initiative isn't becoming I don't know how to say it exactly, but it's not becoming too influenced by like the new thing that seems very relevant. And this happens sometimes. I don't have anything against like fidget toys, but I was thinking of a practical example of this. And it's like fidget toys now have become this big marketable thing. I mean, toys have been around forever, but now it's like the fidget toys and specific fidget things. And so we have, kids who don't focus after being in school all day, and the teachers are like, well, I'm just going to bring in a ton of fidget toys, and we're going to have the fidget toys and the lesson. And I was like, this is not working out well because you have them with their clay and their spinners, and then there's like a rosary over here, and they're like, and I'm like, this is, yeah, I'm like, we need to, and this happens, as I said in the beginning, people are like, oh, it's easier or it's harder to teach adults. You need to have a more sophisticated knowledge. In many ways, there is a sophistication that comes from understanding what we're conveying to kids, even just by context and by what we are kind of pairing or associating for them, because they're going to make the associations. So it's like, okay, well, they got this rosary, but like they also are fascinated by this new thing that they've been playing with the whole class. What are they actually remembering from that? How are they seeing the rosary as something different from that? And that's just one example too. I think it can be many different things. And this happens sometimes where people are like, oh, well, this seems to work well in maybe our school system. I know this is something that came up earlier this year. And I don't know if any of you have heard that. I remember even when I was in high school, like the district was like, let's start this new thing before these hard tests of having people meditate. And we're going to make the kids get into this room and we're going to meditate and do this kind of progressive muscle tension release thing. And anyway, interestingly, like scientifically, that has like been shown to like not work great at all, because once you tense your muscles, you don't actually like untense. But anyway, so that like was like this phase, and like then we're gonna make sure the kids meditate, and then they're gonna do better on these standardized testing that we give them. And so in the beginning of the year, I had someone who was a teacher, and she was like, well, I think we should do this meditation thing, and I have this book that's going to be great. And it's like all these like Buddhist meditation things that have nothing to do with actually the prayer, you know, the richness of the prayer life. So I think making sure that we see the aim of this, the aim of education, is not just to have kids focus and not just to have them do well, be good, but to have them become saints, you know, to have them have a life with Christ, walk with Christ. And I think that's really important, even for them to understand too. Like if you go into a class of little kids and like, you're like, my priority isn't to have you behave and sit still, and like you do something fun with them, then they're like, ooh, like I have like freedom, but they need to have the freedom to be able to start to take on their faith for themselves. So that's a little bit same thing kind of with, and Father alluded to this a little bit last week about how we're trying to break up, and he like thought of a great kind of structure of the day where it's like they're starting off communal prayer, saint skit, and then they're moving to lessons, and then they're moving to another communal activity, more hands-on. But sometimes people are thrown off by a few different things because they're used to maybe how schools are doing it. They're like, well, we're going to do this lesson, then have a break in between, have snacks. I won't go on a snack tangent now, but snacks are an obstacle sometimes to teaching the good news. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, so like some people are like, well, we're going to make this snack, and it ends up being like 10 minutes of snack, and kids could eat snack for an hour. They can continuously eat. And anyway, it becomes a huge distraction. So I guess to sum up that point, it's not just be trying to figure out, okay, what are the new relevant ways to teach kids, that not that none of it has credibility, or to not ever take like outside influence, but to be like, okay, well, what is our goal here? And is that school and what they're doing actually what we want to replicate? Do they have a goal similar to ours? And so I think that's something we're thinking about, especially when people are very well versed in teaching people in another setting. It's like, okay, well, I think there's something different here. And the approach doesn't always transfer one-to-one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you touched on it, but I think it's really important in terms of kind of behavioral expectations. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. Like in a school, so often you're teaching all day long, every day. A lot of what you're doing is controlling behavior, so that you don't go nuts. And I think that can be kind of a first impulse of a teacher when you go into a room and children don't behave like adults do. They just do weird things and they don't pay attention. And I'm talking all the way up through high school. And the first kind of impulse of an adult is to be like, nope, I'm not doing my job if they're not behaving. And so I think that that's really hard to overcome sometimes, especially somebody like Avery walks in, but God forbid, the priest, and the kids are all like, and it's like, oh gosh, I'm mortified because, and I think that's a real challenge for teachers to, and people are really judgmental, right? And you see it sometimes in the church. Like, why don't you have your kids under control? And if a kid is really disruptive of everything and horrible, then you need to make sure that they're moved to a place where they're not disrupting everybody. If they're having a bad day, but I think that to Avery's point, if the goal is not right, the goal of what we're doing is not just imparting facts and content, but it's a relationship. I mean, can you imagine if you went to visit your grandparents and they were like, sit still, behave, memorize this family history. You'd be like, crap, going to grandma stinks. Right? Like, the relationship is what's being handed on, and that requires more freedom because freedom is the necessary precondition for love. And the kids have to want God and want to be close to God. And I think that that's where, to kind of underline that point that Avery just made, we cannot just take a secular model of education and move it over into an ecclesiastical context. Because we're fundamentally not doing the same thing. This is not algebra or reading your ABCs. But I think that requires a lot of discernment, a lot of confidence and skill from catechists. And it is really challenging. And part of that is because most of us, our model of an educator is a teacher who was keeping us in line in school. And so we think that's what it means to be a good teacher.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. We've had teachers become catechists, and then they're like, I'm embarrassed how my class is. They didn't tell us how crazy it was for weeks, and then they're like, I've really been tortured for the last 2 months, but I felt guilty that I couldn't get it together, from having. And it's like, because sometimes kids, it's just the opposite effect. It's like then it becomes a battle, and once they know, or they won't be able to. Later, I'm going to talk a little bit about Don Bosco, who taught, kids who were difficult in many ways, but kind of what we can maybe assume as obvious, they might not be able to pick up on. We're like, well, I'm giving my time and teaching this kid, and I love them. Do they know that? Do they know that from, how your interactions are? And so there's certain ways, like the way of learning it is actually really important. And this is a little, even I had one of those teachers, and some of the secular model too is very, they expect and want to be prepared for a command performance. And this happens sometimes when they're like, oh, well, now Miss Avery or Father Seamus is here. Tell them what you've learned. And then they're all like, and they're like, what is the Eucharist, Sally? And they're like, and they're like, Sally, we told you what the Eucharist was for 5 weeks. And the kids don't respond well. But it's like, okay, well, what are we doing this for? And some of it comes up too when people are like, wow, I'm teaching this class of 3rd, 4th graders, and they don't know the Our Father by heart. And so it's like, well, we need to go tell that parent, you're going to memorize this by this date, and the kid is going to recite the Our Father. And I'm like, I would rather the kid learn the Our Father 3 months from now in a way that is loving and shows that it's not just about memorizing and describing to him slowly what it is, seeing me pray it, Father pray it, all of us pray it together, then send it home to his parent who doesn't go to Mass, who's going to be like, let's pull this out again, and memorize this. The hope is that the parents too can like come along and be a part of that. But it's like, that's actually maybe not the most prudent thing to do, to form some resentment in the learning of something just because we think that child should be there. It's like, okay, hopefully he knows it by the end of the year or by the end of this time. But there's going to be a trade-off if we try to rush this now and try to like go back and make up for all the time lost. We know that we're not trying to make up things now. People are where they are. So any questions on that before we move on to stages a little bit?
How was Jesus' teaching? How was it? Like, how was Jesus allowed kids to come care to him?
Yeah, I mean, we know Father talked about that a little bit last week of like, what did he say? Let the children come to me. They wanted to be closer to him. And we know that he taught a lot, and that kind of lends itself a little bit to the reading from Cavalletti of the parables. Jesus taught in parables, and she was saying that there's like even a progression of how she has found that kids respond to these parables and start to understand the relationship with Christ based on what he taught. She's not reinventing anything. Okay, so we're going to we'll break up a little bit by age. And this will kind of just be a brief overview, and then we'll look at certain topics and maybe discuss how we could convey those at the different age groups. So 2 years and under, 2 years old. This isn't the group. We don't have these kids come and learn catechesis, but we know that, at that point, they're not conscious of having a faith. But you can't forget that hopefully in the 2 years and under, hopefully they're baptized at this point. And so we can't underestimate the leap in development or leap in faith that is, whether, the child is conscious of it or not. We learned about baptism previously. It's an indelible mark. It's effective. It makes them different. So through that baptism, that's a huge part of how we view their development. Now they're Christians. The life of Christ is inside them. And they share that they have the Holy Spirit. So it's really pivotal in shaping someone's identity. So at this age and it's interesting too, if you kind of think about, I'm sure Father Seamus has, done a million baptisms, maybe not a million, and just the kid like taking in and some of you who have had your kids baptized when they were babies, just taking in like the sensory things around them. At that age, as I mentioned, they learn by what's around them, by touch, by their senses, by seeing. They start to learn how to use everyday objects to pick things up, to function with things. At this age, it's still important that there's a regular spiritual life of the family. Hopefully, this is like the ideal, that the family has a spiritual life that 2-year-old or younger participates in some way, of just being there. And Father mentioned this a little bit with even the coming to Mass, which I think is something that I hope we can work more on. Especially, I've heard even recently from a number of parents about just them, especially if they're not as used to going to Mass, or even if they are, and then they have these kids that it's just so hard to wrangle or so hard for them to be quiet during the Mass. And then some of them just don't go to Mass. And it's really, really unfortunate that happens. And it's like there's always that balance. Like you hope that if something really is out of hand, sometimes really out of hand, and we talked about this even with our ushers, to try to assist in some ways, because sometimes people just struggle in what to do and how to react to that situation. But knowing that, if someone is struggling already to make it out the door to come to Mass to bring their infant, and then they know that it's like, okay, well, people around me in the pews are going to be like, oh, I sat by the crying baby. It's, I think, something that we really can think about, not just for 2 and under, even older. I had one of the parents, like they were walking out of faith formation, and then the kids started to like have a little fit. And she's like, you see, this is why we don't go to Mass. And I was like, oh, no, not good. So thinking like, okay, how can we help that? And I don't know, it's something to think about, how to try to make it so that families, I know I've heard people say like the sound of crying babies, this is the sound of the growing church, So to make sure that it's not inconsequential, even though they're not going to like memorize what those first years are really, really important. 3 to 5 years old. Oh yeah.
Just to echo that a little. I remember when I was in Rome, my niece, for the academic ordination, my sister and her husband brought my niece she took her first steps in St. Peter's Basilica. So she,
That's cool.
about a year old.
Yeah. Wow.
And so we're carrying her around. And she'd get into these churches, and it was so funny because she was discovering her own voice. And so she would go to the church and be like, "Wow! And it's the funniest thing. And you see it sometimes, little kids here. It's like, because they're not used to walking into an acoustic like that.
Yeah,
Right?
they can articulate so much louder than a lot of adults.
The hardest thing I think for adults is we think that those years don't matter because we don't remember them. And it's like, well, just because you don't remember it doesn't mean that it's not important. And, somewhere in that, now she's graduating from high school, she's graduating Sunday. But somewhere in that now young woman's mind is this primordial experience of and of being, and a lot of it, as Avery alluded to, is really very sensory. And it's about, and I think that's the same thing with prayer time. It's like, and it's also, believe it, eye contact. This happens often with me. I always make sure when parents bring up a little child during the communion procession, or I give the blessing for the child, I always I try to make eye contact with the child. And I had one just the other day. That kid, I made eye contact, I was trying to be as smiling and warm as I can and give him a blessing. And that kid just was like, everybody around was just like, yeah, good. But I think, again, that child's not going to remember any of that later on in life, but especially it builds. And so, you think about week to week to week, this child, 1 week to the next, a positive builds on a positive. Their experience of prayer, at first it's just like this cacophony of everybody kind of doing something together. Well, where else are they going to hear that? Where else are they going to hear people chanting? Where else are they going to hear music like that? Where else are they going to smell incense? Like, those things are all in there when they're a year old or 2 years old. And it's amazing what a little 1.5, 2-year-old really experiences. Like, it's not unimportant at all. And this is where I think as Catholics, we're a little different from other Christian denominations that have Sunday school, and the kids go to Sunday school, the parents go to church. And they're simultaneous. That has never been a Catholic approach. And I think it's more sacrificial for the parents, because the parent has to be attentive, and the parent needs to be aware when the child is really out of sorts and getting to a place where they can't, and they need to be taken out of the church, or whatever needs to happen. Sometimes that means the parent has to not hear the homily, or the parent can't pray as easily. And so there's a kind of selflessness that's required for parents in that time. And same with prayer. You know, you're like, I want to pray my rosary, but the baby isn't going to let me do it. Well, you know, offer it up. You know, like, that's what you got. You got a baby. And that's part of the piece is you get to kind of respond to where the child is. And I think I'll end with just, my parents one time were at church with the three of us, and we were, apparently my dad says it was like one of these hell weeks. Like, we were all like, like, my sister showed up 3 pews ahead and was like, or like brutal weeks. And the kids were just like, and they were like just juggling. They were trying, like, it was just tough. And they got to the end of Mass, and they're just both like, why did we come? And there was an older couple behind them. And the older couple was just smiling. And I don't know if it was the husband or the wife said to them, you know, these are the best days of your life. And they're like, but you know, I think that's part of this as well, is, you know, you can either kind of, it's about expectations. About, okay, well, you have kids. You know, like, they're not gonna be puppies. They're not gonna be, you know, like, they're gonna be what they are. Like, I thought it was really important what Avery said, like, you take them for where they are. Not where you want them to be, but this is the child you've been given. And fundamentally, the child doesn't belong to you. We're all stewards of a gift in each person. And you've got to look at what you've been given and take the gift as it's given to you, not as you would have it. And that's really important for a teacher and parents. And I think when you got little kids, this is what we're in the little kid phase.
I think it's really, we have a family that has 4 little girls, all under the age of 6. And they were like a can of squirming worms on Sunday. They were also the family that was designated to bring up the gifts. This is never going to happen. I was sitting right behind them, and they were literally like just, they never stopped moving. But when Dad said, okay, it's time to bring up the gifts. They were like, they knew, and because they'd been coming since they were infants, we just watched this little family grow, and they just all stood up. When they got up to Father to bring the gifts, they bowed, they were like, but they knew exactly it was important, they knew what they were supposed to do, because even as infants, even if they don't remember it, a feeling was generated, you know, when they were in church, and so they know that, oh, this is something special, we're gonna do this right. The parents didn't have to say anything to them, they just lined up, they did exactly what they were supposed to do, and one of them was only 2 years old, but she, you know, carried something up. It was really beautiful to watch, but I thought, this is never gonna happen, but it did, so, it does, they do take it in,
That's really cool. Yeah, I think it was a good point too of what Father was saying about it being different from other churches and us not being like, take the kids out, put them in a playroom separately while the parents go to Mass. I remember I don't know if any of you read The Story of a Soul from St. Therese, but she writes in that I think one of her earliest memories from when she was like 4 years old or 5 years old was she said being at mass with her father and just looking at her father, not even paying attention to what was going on, but just like looking at him and seeing how serious he believed like what was going on. She would just like look at him, and she was like, I knew something was serious and that he believed just because of how prayerful he was.
You know, I know some churches still have a cry room. I'm thinking like Our Lady of Perpetual Help in Wyndham, they have a cry room there. But it seems like it's not as popular anymore. Is that something that the church is trying to?
I don't know. I don't know if
What is that?
it's like a
separate room that's got
with a window.
windowed in, you know, so they
They
can see
they
that.
almost created that here in the cathedral,
Oh,
if you
yeah.
think about that.
In the audience.
I mean, the challenge, so I think that it's really tough in the sense that you're really consigning the child to a miserable experience. I mean, who wants to sit in a cry room? Children are no different from anybody else. And I think that, you know, especially the acoustic is closed, and there are a lot of other things that, you know, it's like, get me out of here. So I think that the cry room functioning as a bailout room, that seems to me okay in the sense that, say that, you know, the family is at mass and the 2-year-old, this is the one I always loved, so I know it very well now. I'll be offering mass and I'll hear a thud. And I know some child just hit their head on something.
This is great.
And it's a delay, and you know what's coming, right? We all, I'm just sitting there going, here it comes. You know, because you know, right? It's like, ah! And sure enough, and now, okay, like you're not gonna recover from that easily, and you're gonna completely disrupt everything. So that's the time you pick the child up, you take them up. And I will say this about architecture too, these big modern churches in the round, not so great for babies because there's no discrete place to sit. Everybody is facing everybody. There's no side aisle to get out in. There's no discrete column to hide behind and nurse a child. You don't have an easy exit. It's tough. A lot of they're not family friendly. Whereas if you look at, I mean, we built churches for hundreds of years. We kind of figured this out, and a lot of the reason they were built this way was so that you had various people of different places, ages, etc., that could find a place in the church where that would fit where their family was at that particular time. And, you know, I think that that's a poverty of some contemporary architecture, is it doesn't give families really a lot of, it's like you're either in the church or you're outside, but there's nowhere in the church that is discreet, off to the side, in a corner. You can't bail out anywhere. And whereas you go to these big cathedrals and big churches in Europe, and there are all kinds of crevices and corners that you can go kind of discreetly deal with an issue. So I think that's something that architects just, you know, again, it's taking our cue from the person rather than some kind of hypothetical abstract idea of like, church is a tent. And, well, I get it, you want to recreate Exodus and whatever, but like, we're people. This isn't an idea, this is a congregation. So anyway, I got a little bit sad, but I think we gotta, like, babies, I think for that, cry rooms are not, I don't think it's appropriate, and I think the church generally has moved away from the idea that families with children, little children, would go into a cry room at the beginning of Mass and stay there throughout. That, to me, is inappropriate. if you need to bail out to a cry room, if the child just is inconsolable or something has happened, fine. And it's important to have places to bail out to.
Yeah, you have
I'd like to share that I think from my observation, being going to a Catholic school and being brought up in, I have 5 sisters, and so being at church is actually kind of nice because there's so much going on all the time, but it doesn't underestimate that the fact that, like in the Catholic school where I went, you would go to a mass during the middle of the day, right, where all the noise, and it was quiet. And the archangel, the pink, and it created that space, that environment, right, where you could, I developed that relationship, right, and so it was in that silent, and it was just a rare time, because the rest of the day and everything, the weekend going home was just a lot of action, a lot of emotion, but I think that creating that space where you can have that and create that space for that child, the children, at least in my observation, can develop that interior relationship with Jesus. And that's where I found Jesus. The churches, like I'll go a little further, just a little bit further, just to say like the churches were packed. You had to get there early. And I know it's different today, and it might have been like, I don't want to be here, this is hard to endure, you want to. But something simple, like my father saying one thing when I was 8 years old, that is Jesus becoming the body and blood of Christ. That, him saying that to me, gave that relationship with me a meaning to saying, that's what matters, and that's where, it can make a difference. It's just that space is what I'm trying to say, is that sacred place, different place.
That's really beautiful. And sometimes I think people are hesitant maybe to bring kids into a space like that because they're like, I don't know if they can handle it. We do adoration with the kids, and it's like, I think people would be surprised by how, I mean, they move a little bit, but they can go to adoration for a little bit and it's peaceful, mostly,
I would find this at the school where I was chaplain. How I sometimes would take time after the reception of Holy Communion to just sit and pray. I found they can take a certain amount of that. I would sit after Holy Communion and I would just sit there and it would be quiet. And they would all be quiet. And it was interesting. I said, at one point I was having a retreat and it was like this little 6, 7-year-old, and I said, where have you felt closest to God? I asked these little kids, where have you felt closest to God? Well, a lot of them were talking about with my family at Christmas, or with my family at, these important family times. And it was interesting though, I had a few different small groups. These were small groups we rotate around, so like 8 kids, 6 or 8 kids. I'd see like 5 groups rotate. And in 2 or 3 of those groups, these little kids were like, that time after communion was quiet? So, we don't, sometimes we don't give them enough credit. We don't really, like you're saying, you were one of those kids that was sitting there and just being like, this is kind of nice. And not only is this nice, but there's someone on the other side of this. So.
It's kind of cool. Yeah, sometimes we underestimate it. And sometimes I think children have a capacity more so than their parents sometimes to have that little that prayerful experience. Sometimes the parents will be like they can't concentrate or stay quiet with the kids. So 3 to 5, we're gonna say something.
Yeah, maybe we can kind of address that, the family not to worry too much and be aware of that so that they can come into church. Sometimes they feel like, they are there, but they are not paying attention. They are not listening to the hungry, serving people, and they feel like just bad. But we know that they're supposed to be there, all of them, so that can give them a little bit of hope and just
Yeah. I think just like Father was saying, the parents or the older couple that encouraged his parents. Probably that's a lot.
To follow up what she did about if you start from when they're babies, it may seem like they're crazy, but if they've been going to Mass every week from the time they were 2 months old to the time they were 2, they're going to be much more capable of Mass at 2 years old than if you start going to Mass when they're 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is a mistake that I think parents make sometimes. They're like, well, we'll start going to Mass or we'll bring the kids to Mass when they're ready. Well, they're not gonna be ready because they aren't going to Mass. And so you gotta be bringing them to Mass, and then they'll get ready. That's how you get ready, is by experiencing it. And I think Avery had brought this up to me, like, well, because you might want to explain. Remember, it was Easter, right?
Yeah. That's what it was. Yeah, on Easter there were so many families that I just had never seen. And a bunch, I'm forgetting exactly what happened, but yeah, there was a bunch, and it was like, why aren't they here? And you kind of see little things like someone peel off here and there and be like a little like disoriented because they just haven't been to Mass with the kids. And so I was thinking, I was like, if they could be encouraged to come every week.
I remember that in that Mass, there was one couple, they brought kids in, they clearly didn't know children. It was probably their first experience going to church. So the kids are like, wow. They don't know what a church is. They don't know how to, and the parents were just like,
And of course it's super crowded.
It was Easter
Packed.
Sunday, so like one of the harder ones to get through. And halfway through the Mass, I watched as she picked up the child and walked out the back door. And the father and the diaper bag. Like it was like, we're done, we're bailing out.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, and that was in Avery, you watched, and she watched the same, and we were just like, how do we try and not have that happen? But I think a lot of it is, if you don't take your kid to Mass until they're that old, good luck.
Yeah, it's a challenge. We didn't take a break. I'm wondering if we should take a little break. We only made it to 2 years old though. Time went fast. Let's take like a 5 or less minute break, and then we'll go past 2 years. 3 to 5 years old. So kind of key things at this age. Imaginary play is a huge milestone. Kids have a huge imagination. And you can really engage the children's imagination in this, especially storytelling at this age. Storytelling, symbols, teaching symbols, and also the same thing of experiences. All of these aren't like, all of them will blend into it. So the same thing we said for 2 and under will apply, obviously, across the board. So experiences, their interaction with other children increases. They're more social at this age. They're kind of opening a lot of different social doors. They tend to think more black and white, children, even though they have a huge imagination. But their imagination, it can be like reality, imagination, go back and forth. Anyone who has interacted with children kind of knows at that age, it's like, did that happen or didn't it? You don't quite know. And part of this too, as they try to understand, they're developing more of a vocabulary and they're more verbal. And maybe they're being taught about God. oftentimes children now, and we touched upon this a little bit for the 2 and under, their experience of their parents and other adults are going to influence the qualities they think of with God, right? So if you're saying God is an important person, God is Father, God is in relation, they're going to learn from the other people that they have relationships with what that means. You know, if you say God is love, they are going to learn from the love that they experience. So a lot of what they're going to understand from that age is based on their experience from other relationships, and especially their parents at that time. Like I said, a lot of stories at that time. Kids love to kind of figure out stories. And even at that age, more so probably like a little bit older, but they love to like recount things that happened, right? Recount like, oh, when we did that. I remember my niece went through that phase. Everything was like, remember when I was little? I was like, you're still little. But she meant like little, like 2 years old. She's like, when I was little, we did this like one time. But like she thought it was all the time. And so they recount stories a lot. So it's great to teach them the stories. And also reading at this age is very, very important. And I think this is something that, as technology use, even for this age bracket, increases a lot, there's a little bit less language development, right? If they're not being read to, they're not kind of looking at books, kind of trying to piece together based on what they're hearing. So being read to is a big part of stimulating their intellectual development at this point. A little bit older, yeah.
One thing that I've noticed, I don't know, this age is when children first encounter death. Death. You wouldn't think it would be that early, but it is. And it's not not the way that we understand, but I remember my little niece, I was telling her, I used to just make up stories on the fly, and I don't know, probably, I was scared. My sister would be like, you gave them nightmares again. Sorry. But anyway, there was, that was a great uncle. But I was telling my niece some story about they were being chased by a pack of wolves, and the wolves went flying off a cliff, and they were rescued. And she said, did they die? And I said, well, yeah, I guess they probably did die. And she said, I can't wait to die. And I said, oh, why? And she said, I'll get to be with Jesus. Right? But again, like, so there's not, but even I was just home last week, and my little 2.5, she's almost 3-year-old niece, I'm like, I don't know, I said something about, I forget what it was, and it's like, she just very matter-of-factly was like, yeah, and then I'm gonna die. And I was like, okay, we're all gonna be dead. You know? But it was like, she's 3, you know? And I find this with like, but there is, it's the first time they start to become aware of the transcendent.
And
And
they're very practical about it.
they are, but they can start, this is where you need to start talking about the soul. Because they start to really develop the sense that there's more to life than this world. And that's where this whole concept of death comes in. And so I think this is where the stories cannot just, and this is why I have a problem with a lot of these modern stories, is they're so horizontal. They're not fairy tales enough. Like Chesterton talks about how important fairy tales are. Because this fantastical realm is like, it opens up their horizons beyond just their experience. And they start to think, well, there can be things that are real outside of what I experience. Like unicorns and like dragons. And so it creates the intellectual space for faith to grow in. Whereas if they just have like see spot run spot run, well, I mean, that's not going to open up a lot of space for God. So these kinds of more fantastical things, that they realize that their imagination can comprehend things that are much bigger than their experience. And then that says, maybe life is bigger than my experience. So I think that happens at that age. That happens at that age. It's earlier than we might think, but.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the thing of like, why is it good? I don't know if people still as much, but like when kids read like C.S. Lewis or something like that, it's like, it's like a window into something greater. And that's why, I assume why he wrote stories like that. That would just be, yeah. A little bit older, 6 to 9, roughly-ish. Kids learn to read, usually, somewhere, if not a little bit earlier. And they have a more sophisticated understanding of time. This is kind of interesting, too, at this age. There was a kid a few weeks ago, and he asked me like a million times, when was Jesus born? And when did he die? And when was this? And like relation. And he was just like fascinated by it. He was like, okay. And even, I mean, it's a thing to think about, like as they're kind of developing these understandings of certain things, like the questions that might come up of how it applies then to what they already learned. And sometimes, it's easy as like a teacher's like, oh, let's stay on topic of what we're talking about. But some of these, it's like, that's a really relevant question because some people don't know the context of the time of how long ago was it from this date? What year are we now? How do we number the years? What significance does this have in the history of us, And so it's like, no, that's a really good question. And so he's like, I don't know, what is BC, what is AD? So it's like, okay, that's actually a cool thing that you're thinking about this. Children in school this period, I mean, now they're entering school age more so, some of them before this, but there's a restlessness there, right? Some of them struggle with this form of classroom education. There's a lot of emotions at this age too. Some, they're starting to regulate their emotions in certain ways. And like Father Seamus was saying, they're kind of learning at this age too to like move beyond what they experience themselves. Like they're very self-focused maybe, or they can only really understand their perspective from themselves. But then they're like, okay, well, there's other things out there besides what I'm experiencing. And they just have more wonder. They wonder a lot of things. So even before this, I would say, but like the like what if questions and like what happens when. So that it's like fun at that age group too. So like what they're like imagining, like, well, what happens in heaven? I think I told you the one of them because do we have clothes in heaven? And like they just start to imagine and wonder all of these questions, which are really interesting. What happens after someone dies? What happens? Why did that happen to my family? Or what happens if this goes wrong? So the cause and effect questions of like what happens when, and sometimes it's very concrete, like they can know this happens, then this happens. And they begin to notice, even before this, but maybe more concretely at this age, since they're becoming more social, their friends and other people around them and their spiritual practices. You see this a lot at this age, at least from my experience of like, well, I noticed my friend does this, or my friend said they believe that. Or my uncle, someone in their family, they don't go to church. My niece would do this all the time, like, so-and-so says this about God, or like, they start to pick up on other people's spirituality and their relationship with God a lot. Still fascinated by stories and rituals too. They can understand, I think, a lot about rituals. And that's, I think, kids across the board in general, if you kind of think of it, about how it kind of helps set up a schema of the world for them when there is rituals and they start to understand these tangible things of how we live our sacramental life. In this age range, then, that's what we would call the age of reason falls within there. Around the age of 7, it could vary slightly, but at the age of 7 then, we would say that they are able to reason. They would be able to receive First Holy Communion, in our diocese confirmation at the same time with restored order. And so they're entering into a more sophisticated understanding now of the faith to some extent. And I think at this age too, they really want to know how things are, like they want to know reality. So they're getting it's not like, okay, let's sit here and just imagine something, or but they're curious how things are a lot. And that's something to keep in mind, to not take things out of the context of reality too much. I can talk about this a little later too, the time. But this happened we had a class, and around this age range, like I said, people would be preparing for confirmation and First Holy Communion. And we had a class of like second-ish graders, 2nd to 4th grade in this age range. And one of the teachers wanted to take the chalice and the paten and the unconsecrated hosts and bring it to their classroom in the guild hall and do a lesson on transubstantiation, not using that language for the kids, but on the Eucharist. And it was like, it's taking it very much out of the context of reality. And you're taking away a lot of what makes things sacred, just for them to understand, even if they can't necessarily understand always in an intellectual way of the sacredness of it, just coming into that space. And I remember I was talking to Father Seamus about it, and he wisely was like, also a priest should be there because their understanding is going to be thrown off if it's like, okay, well, what happened? This is really odd. This bread is going to become Jesus, but we're learning about this on a folding table in the guild hall, and there is no priest around. It can't be separated because they want to know what the reality is. And I've seen this over and over again. They won't connect it as well. It won't resonate with them. This happened with confession too. One of the teachers was, we did this whole retreat on confession, and Father did an example, all this stuff. But we get to the retreat, and everyone knows that it's the retreat on confession. So they're going to learn about it, review, hopefully, because they should have been learning about it in class, to learn about it, see Father Seamus do an example with Father Kevin, and then they're going to receive their first confession, their first sacrament of reconciliation. So, everyone knows about it, it's been on the calendar, blah, 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 and we get to it, and one of the catechists is there with one of her students, and she's like, oh, Nancy, ready to learn about confession? And she's like, what's that? We laugh. I was like, oh no. And the catechist after was like, we talked about confession for so long. But I was like, well, what did you talk about confession? She didn't see the confessional. She didn't see, okay, how you do it. It was so out of context that she didn't understand that anything you described in there was related to what was happening in the church here. So it was like, but they remember when they go in the confessional and like see it before they go, or they see Father do an example of it outside, because they want to know what things really are, just like all of us. We don't want to know what things partially are, or like an odd kind of extracting of something, because it doesn't resonate and it won't make sense. So they don't like extractions and it doesn't work well. So it's kind of understanding that it's the fullness of what that is. And so expecting them to learn things in a way that's oddly abstract is not great. A little bit older than that, 10 to 14. Yeah. I should have asked if you had something before we moved on.
There are two things that come to mind about this age.
Yeah.
One being, this is when they develop a sense of irony.
Mm.
And I love that at this age because you can just tell them some ironic thing and you get them to belly laugh. Because they just love, it's like, because they're so concrete, like Avery was saying, when you're like, you give them some absurd thing, anything, you kind of make it up off the top of your head. What are we gonna do now? Let's go jump in the, where? No! Should we do this? No! And they just love that dissonance because it's funny. But as Avery said, don't do that when you're trying to teach them something. But because they find it so absurd, like they're very concrete. So you say something like out in left field, and they're like, "Wow!" They just think it's the funniest thing you could have said. The other piece is this is when they start telling their own story.
Mm.
And I learned this the very hard way. In first and second grade, third grade, do not ever bring up pets or accidents. You will never get out of the classroom. My pet. And then next thing you know, somebody's pulling off clothing to show you where they got a cut here and they got you start bringing, because they want to tell the world about everything that ever happened to them, and they will tell, they don't really know what not to say. My mom says that, and they're like, oh no, let's keep going with this lesson. So this age is like, they like to hear stories and they like to tell stories. And so that's another part of this age. And that can be harnessed in different ways too, right?
Yeah, I remember from one of these altar server trainings, I think he uses irony a lot in them, but they're practicing like their pose, and he's like, well, you're gonna go home and do it like to your brother and around, and they're like, ha! They know. It's funny too, because then it's like they know that's not what, they know that's out of context. It's interesting. Okay, a little bit older, 10 to 14. Dramatic changes. Ugh, tough age. So again, they're increasingly more social, and trying to navigate that a lot is a tough period for kids socially. They're strongly influenced by friends. They have strong emotions. Puberty starts for many of them. They start to move a bit from concrete to more abstract thinking at this age. And many start to push away from their parents a little bit, start to rebel. And so I think that's a thing to know too, of just how we approach some of what happens at that age. Sometimes when if you're doing things that are only for like parent and middle schooler together, probably not the best. They want some space from their parents. And it also kind of is good for parents to realize that too, that hopefully before then also there's someone else in their life who's a protagonist in the faith or has some influence in the faith that's but not them. That there's hopefully that there can be some other influences, because they're gonna notice that a lot, that it's not just something mom and dad do or grandma or someone else from the family, but no, there's these people, friends, other adults, family friends, teachers, people in the church, and they will remember that a lot, like, oh, this person from the church, and making connections with them. And I think, at that age too, because it's all the social challenges, they want to be really social, but it's difficult for people to kind of to try in some way to foster that connection, especially as they might be withdrawing a bit or trying to distance themselves from family in some ways. They also start to very much see contradictions in the world, and might be like hypersensitive, especially in religious and spiritual beliefs. And so they're going to confront a lot of these questions. I know our middle schoolers are like 12 to whatever, this age range. Think of just a bunch of questions. And I like what Father mentioned last week about this, which I think is a really good point. When they see someone who's not afraid of the questions, but it's like they realize, oh, that person had that same question and like followed through and looked into it. And then even posing a question that's even a little bit more interesting, a little bit more pertinent, but like bigger, then it's like, wow, there's a depth of our faith that it can withstand expansive questioning and wondering, and it can deepen it by wondering more about it. And so I think that that's a big thing of just encouraging the questions and being excited, that it's like, wow, that's really nice that kid is asking that at that age. And with the influence of peers, certainly at all ages, but they're hearing a variety of different things that if they see someone else pose a contradiction, they, want to kind of measure up to their friends too, so if they see that and then they don't have a way to kind of say like, oh, well, what my friend said this, this is what one of the middle schoolers said the other week, my friend said Jesus is not really God, and this is all made up and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, how do you help them think through what is a response to that? Or like, what does that mean? Why was he saying that? And how do you start to help them to reason through what they know in their faith already, which they can start to do at this age and even before. But some of these things that especially, and I guess I was going to mention this a little bit later, but as their brains are developing in so many other subjects and areas, they're being fed a lot more because they're forced to in many ways through going to school. And if their knowledge of the faith is lagging behind, it creates a huge insecurity for them, especially if they're in a very secular environment. So it's like, I'm the one kid who's Catholic, and they're telling me that there's a contradiction in the faith, and I don't know exactly, how to deal with that. And so it's important, and this is part of the hope of having children actually continuously learn about the faith, not just up until sacrament prep years, because it's like if you knew the math, we talk about this, if you knew the math that you learned in second grade, it would not hold up to how much you develop. I was thinking of it even, I remember being in high school and learning math and being like, wow, that thing that I thought was a general principle actually wasn't a general, it was just a really small piece of it. If you think about from kids fitting shapes into blocks to putting together geometric proofs, there is a huge expanse of what they've developed and learned from there. But if they've stopped at a level of learning the sign of the cross and how to receive Holy Communion, and then these questions that are so much bigger about like the existential questions that the kids will come up with, it's like, well, it doesn't seem like it really is serious because I just learned how to do the sign of the cross and say a Hail Mary, if that's where it stops. So I think that's a real challenge of just how to continue to learn about the faith in a level that develops with the child, because it's already, I mean, if you see like the amount of kids then who have gone through sacrament prep, always a huge drop off then of who comes back for the next year. And I think recently we're trying to make little movements towards that, but it could be a lot more. Because the thing that's going to happen is they get to middle school, high school, and it's like, that's not, especially if the family isn't continuously learning or teaching or conveying, it's not going to withhold some of these questions unless they're, it takes a lot of motivation if they were going to like look some of this up on their own, which some of them do. They're like, I'm going to read this or look, but they need the resources to do that and the help to do it. But even just like the smallest thing of like them asking a question, one of them the other day was like, well, someone told me God isn't real because of the Big Bang theory. They were like, one of the friends, I was like, you know who theorized about the Big Bang theory? It was a Catholic priest. And they were like so impressed. They were like, really? I was like, this doesn't take that much. But just kind of knowing some of these things. And also, I mean, even you all, I know some of our students have parents in this class and they're like, oh yeah, my dad's going to catechism tonight. And some of the other kids were like, what, your dad? He's like, yeah, like for adults, like to kind of hopefully see a norm in that. It's like, okay, you're supposed to learn about your faith throughout your life. So a lot of questioning and hopefully some developing of the faith. At this time too, and also in the age range before, they're forming identity like rapidly, and a lot of them are joining groups or really more seriously taking part in activities that are like passions for them, hobbies, and these groups, everything of sports becomes more serious at this age usually, and some of the other groups, even music or different arts. And so they're forming their identity based on these, and also alongside with other people. It's a very social thing for them. So thinking of how, okay, if they're forming their identity in all these places, how does their faith fit into that? There's a weighing of things, like if there's a pie chart and all of the time and effort and social relationships are all outside of the church, and you have this one little, at least hopefully there's a little sliver, it's going to be really challenging for people to see that as part of their identity. But I think as much for this age to not just see it, and Father talks about this a lot too when he works with the middle schoolers, but to not just see it as a time of like they're learning and we're catechizing and we're going through doctrine and stuff, but that we're shaping and reminding them of their identity, And it can be something, I noticed this, like we were learning about sacraments in middle school this past semester, and we were talking about like the sacraments that they received, and sometimes people don't even, to receive a sacrament and to not really even see it as like a hugely weighted part of your life is an interesting thing, because it's like, okay, I go to these classes, I'm going to receive this sacrament. But I think that's one thing that we've tried to do too, of like, how can we make sure people know that this is a big deal, that they're, as you would like be excited and like anticipate a wedding or like some big thing in your family's life, how can that be also for a sacrament? Because that's part of shaping your identity too, of receiving the sacraments. We've had a ton of kids in this age range who recently came, I guess their families kind of came back to the church to some degree. But it seems like the last few years, there's just been a lot in this age range who are preparing for the sacraments, who haven't received them at a younger age. And so that's an interesting thing too, of kind of the challenges that, once you get beyond a certain age, there's some extra questioning and difficulties that, arise when preparing to receive the sacraments. So yeah, trying to shape this in some way to be the identity. I know for our middle school class on Sundays, a lot of them were being confirmed with adults and teens this past year. And I went into the class and I was talking to them. I was like, well, who are you inviting to your confirmation? Which friends? And they were like, oh, like just like my mom's friends and stuff. And I was like, well, maybe think about asking some of your friends to this. Because this isn't just about your mom, your parents doing this, but if this is an important day for you, try to invite some. And it was cool. I saw like a bunch of middle school, high school. And at first it was funny. One of them came in and I was like, does he think he's being confirmed today? And he came up to me, he's like, no, I'm just here for my friend. I was like, oh, thank God. I thought he was confused. So it was sweet. But yeah, trying to help that shape their identity. Also at this age, many of them, they can kind of see that they might rely on friends and other people a little bit more, that their relationships shape them more than maybe they have thought of in the past. And so that's an important age too, of like having other people in addition to parents to kind of help shape spiritual practices and religious practices. Like I said, of the same thing of joining groups, they can be very communal at this age and rooted in being a part of a group, So that's something too that can be utilized, it's a good thing. They're also, like I said, before the younger age group of noticing their friends' practice of the faith. At this age too, maybe becoming a little bit more evaluative of the community's faith and the larger community in the church, or noticing people a bit more from a little bit more of an objective view. So I think in this time they could, as I said, it could go one way of them suppressing critical questions, about the faith, of them saying, well, no one might know. Or you hear this sometimes. I hear a lot of adults say this, like, well, I fell away from the faith because no one answered my questions. I'm sure many of you have heard that before. But kind of helping guide how to question, what is a good question, and also making sure they're not embarrassed to question things. Do you have?
Just one thing that, in my experience, at this age, there's often a bit of a development gap that opens up between boys and girls. Because the girls often hit puberty before the boys, and they become a lot more social and socially aware before the boys. The boys sometimes are like, let's go play Legos, and the girls are like, you're a loser. And just physically, the boys were like, they were kind of, you looked at like a 4th and 5th grade class, the girls and boys were like, ooh, and they're kind of all about the same size. And then all of a sudden you hit 6th, 7th grade, and all of a sudden some of the girls are like, way up here, and it's just this whole thing. So, and you find that it does open up a gap where in this age group, sometimes single gender activities are actually very important.
Yeah.
Because they have a hard time being comfortable in mixed gender activities all the time. They need some of that, and if you think about a lot of especially if they're involved in athletics,
Yeah.
they're socialized single gender a lot. So, I found that's pretty common. The other piece is that, kind of along the lines of what Avery's saying, this is when they're really developing, I find this is when they're asking a lot of moral questions, ethical questions. They want to know about what's the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do, and they start to develop a sense of, this is when the whole like hypocrisy, like if you're the parent, and you have anything in your life that's hypocritical, this is when they're gonna call you out on it. They're gonna be like, you said, and you're not doing it. And you're like, oh no, I'm gonna strangle you. So this is that kind of age too, but what's, and the positive thing that like, we try and do with this age group is look at virtues. So that we're not just looking at the negatives, but we're looking at, well, what are the virtues that we're striving for? And they still, like, we also are, we will use lives of the same, they are inspired by heroism. They're often looking for kind of heroes at this age, superheroes. It's not just the little kids. They're trying to figure out how to live, and it's about, as Avery said, identity. Who are they following? And I used to do that, like when I first was ordained, I was involved in the high school youth ministry. And the priests that was often what we would do, priests would end up in high school youth ministry. Not anymore. This is where we need to be very much present. Middle school is where we lose children. And precisely because of what Avery said, they start asking some pretty crazy questions, and if you are not there, and many times our catechists don't have the confidence to really go into some of the nitty-gritty on some of these pieces, and they get flustered, and sometimes these middle school programs would be like just kind of superficial, icebreakers, and let's have a little thing about whatever and talk about whatever. And so you'll have all the risk is that we're just doing all this kind of superficial stuff that's kind of not, like, especially in this era, they're on smartphones in middle school, which means they're on TikTok, which means they are basically walking down a dark alley at night by themselves every evening. With what they're exposed to. They're literally traumatized by what they're seeing. And they're already, almost all the boys have been exposed to pornography. Many of the girls. There's just a lot coming at them. In a secular society, a lot of really, this is when the heavy doses of gender ideology start coming in. Then they start the whole questions of gender, my identity, am I a boy, am I a girl? All of these things start blowing up. They start saying, then you have other kids that become like completely inappropriate. And they hurt each other. Like I would ask the seniors every year at the senior retreat, I'd say, what was your hardest year of school? 8th grade. 7th grade, 8th grade. They just beat the crap out of each other. They bully each other horribly. And they're vicious, and especially the girls. And it can be just absolutely horribly vicious. And this is where we're, like, almost every week, Avery or I or whoever's leading that is like basically saying, you have to stop treating each other like this. This is not the way we treat each other. You might treat each other like that out there. You don't treat each other like that in here. You don't say that kind of thing about somebody. You don't say that kind of thing to somebody. Like, it's just constantly like charity. because they're just getting hit all the time. And so it's a battlefield. Middle school is a battlefield. And every time we have those classes, you come out of them and you're like,
It's true. It's not for the faint of heart. It's like
Middle school is tough, but it's also, it can be really, like, there can be really beautiful things that these kids do. Because they can be remarkably, they want to be heroic. They also want to do heroic things together. So, but it's harnessing that and getting them not to tear each other to pieces. That's the challenge.
I think it also, just to add a little, I think the pressures of our culture to keep religion private and how it works into the adults, teaching and just trying to facilitate the faith so they can have that confidence in faith, but I think it's an interplay between the two, because they need that self-confidence in the faith,
Without but it's funny because they'll be like, they'll get really confident in the faith and they'll be like, you're going to hell and you're going to hell and you're going to hell. It's because they're middle schoolers.
Right, exactly.
Prudence, frontal temporal lobe, that's not developed yet.
No.
They do not understand. They will say things. I'm like, what did
it will
you say?
it will blow your mind. You're like,
You can't say that. So this is part of this age is it's really just trying to, you have to not, for me it's hard because I just, half the time you want to be just, that is so inappropriate, you feel like you morally have to be that's really bad, don't ever do that. But if you did that every time, that's all you'd be saying the whole time, sometimes, so you have, it's trying to find context where they can really do things well, and you have to give them a lot of room at this age, because they're gonna screw things up and say really dumb things all the time. And they need to be loved through it. And also consoled a lot because they get hurt a lot and they're awkward and they're just, it's painful to be a middle schooler. So they as much as they're hard to love, this is probably when they need it the most.
Is that hormonal change, maybe?
no, there's a lot of
Yeah,
hormonal
that's
changes
why-
too.
Hormones are
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
Craziness.
I think you're right. I think at any age, the teacher needs to regulate themselves a lot, but especially with middle school, because it's what you just need to really grow in virtue, be patient with them. And the thing is too, this is one thing I was thinking of. Groups are a big thing at that age because they are becoming more social, and the group dynamic of the classroom is really important. Even I think even more so at this age than any younger age, because it can really work to the benefit or to the detriment of the classroom. If someone is there and they're just completely antagonistic, they're not really searching for what is true, or they don't they just want to kind of continuously jab. That's something to really make a prudent decision about what to do in that context, because it really impacts everyone else and the whole tone of the class, because they're so influenced by what other people are saying. So if you have someone that is constantly jabbing or and not just, they do to each other too, but even challenging of the faith, to be I hate being here, this is baloney, all of that. So that's something to watch the dynamic. I've seen it work even in the opposite way of being really helpful on our Sunday middle school class. They're a quieter group than on the Wednesdays, but there is, you see sometimes the dynamic of like, someone who's a little bit more confident. Sometimes if it's like someone of the opposite sex, if they have like a little crush, but like someone who's a little more confident and they take it seriously. And then like some of these other kids who, if they were in a different context, would be like, okay, I'll do, like you see like they start to take it a little seriously then. So the dynamic of the class in that way can really help. If there's some people who are pretty admirable to the others and their classmates, and then they kind of set a little bit of a tone. And I think that's something that even middle schoolers, especially even one-on-one, can understand at that age a little bit. Like Father was saying, like people like heroes, and they like doing the right thing. If you kind of challenge them, be like, well, can you help set the tone for this? They will respond. At that age, they can start to like respond to things like that, to see that they have a role in the classroom for kind of setting the tone. So it's kind of interesting. 15 and older. This is like a mixed bag. This is a little less concrete than the other. So, I mean, we're all going to be developing until we die, but people can just vary so much with this, because now we're thinking, someone their brain isn't fully developed by this age. It will take a little bit longer, but their logic, their abstract thinking is hopefully more developed by this later adolescent period. And they can start to understand more of a gray area, question that more, and see like what is that gray area. And the hope is too that they expand and continue to expand their reasoning, although many still struggle at that time, especially struggling with reasoning and having that interplay with their actions. There's still some impulsivity at that age, and just a lot of new experiences as they kind of start to get into emerging early adulthood. So that part, this is a challenge for us, the high school age too, especially if they haven't been, as Father was saying, the importance of middle school, if they haven't been plugged in the faith and engaged by high school, it's really hard for them to start then. And it's a lot about, all similar to the middle school, like the social context, being with other people, not feeling like you're the only one there. Also similar to this, single gender still, I think a lot of the times, even though they're interacting maybe more so, but you can tell like when we have classes like with mixing, there's a divide. Like we had an event even for high schoolers where they were baking, and it was like line down the middle, all the guys wanted to be together, all the girls wanted to be together. So there's still that gender divide of that. They can feel more comfortable, open up a little bit more when they're with their same gender. This age too is with technology. I mean, we're seeing kids in 4th, 5th grade beyond have been using technology, but especially kids now at this age who have grown up with more than half their life or more on technology, on iPads, on screens, really impacted by that. And especially just being exposed to kind of at like the touch of their hands, like these things that really shape how they kind of see their identity with social media, with how people are presenting themselves, what their life should be like. This period is this and emerging adulthood. In like social psychology, they say this is like isolation versus socialization time, where like people can withdraw sometimes or try to socialize more. And interestingly, with social media, it's face-to-face time is less, at least statistically, than it has been in the past. So that's something to keep in mind too. Sometimes we might think, this goes back to the relevance thing of like, okay, how can we be relevant to people? Someone had mentioned this, like, should our parish get a Snapchat? Absolutely not. We should not get Snapchat. But, how much to weigh, how to reach high school students, but also give them opportunities to socialize and have an experience where they're building meaningful relationships that they crave. Obviously, we all want that. They're not any different from us in wanting that. But how to facilitate that at that age, they need a lot of help with getting their bearings, because many of us adults don't even know how to do it well. So if the church, and especially, at the directory for catechesis was explaining, catechesis is a part of it, but really catechesis is always paired with the pastoral care of the whole person. And I think that's a really important point that it makes, that it's like, okay, this is one piece of it, but their formation in the faith is them as a whole person then. And I think that's an important thing of like how, and we were talking about this, Father was saying about like it being a priority of kind of not just teaching the faith to some high schoolers who come, but how to build actually a culture, and have them as a whole person be, involved in this, not just their intellect. Okay, I was going to move on a little bit. Do you have something for that age?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is when they are most able to start praying seriously.
Mm.
You're not going to really get that in middle school even. They just can't. But high school, they can start to handle something like Lectio Divina.
Mm.
They can start to enter into and lead and actually appreciate the liturgy of the hours.
Mm.
If they are given good explanation, they can get a lot more out of Mass.
Mm.
They can start regular practice of mental prayer and the rosary. This is when their spiritual lives can really blossom.
Mm.
And but it has to be, they need mentors and guides and support from peers. It's an age when they want to take responsibility, and they want to lead, but they don't always know how to handle the burdens of responsibility and leadership. So they're like, well, we'll do it. We're going to do it. We don't want to be told. We don't want you telling us what to do. We're going to plan it. And then they go and plan it. It's like, so they decide, well, we want to go to Rome. The high school kids. We want to go to Rome. So we're going to raise money to go to Rome. So we're going to have a bake sale. So we're like, well, a bake sale, you're going to have a lot of bake sales. And they're like, well, maybe you could make like some kind of, more high-end kind of things and so they were going through this whole thing. And then it was like, well, we're going to make fudge. So then they decided they're going to make fudge. Well, then of course it ends up, they don't know what they like research kind of haphazardly some recipes. They ask Avery to get the ingredients. They come in to cook the fudge. I walk in and it's like, they're all kind of like shell-shocked a little bit because I don't know how often they cook anything. And then I go and I taste the fudge and I'm like, what the heck? It was salty as all get out. I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, we just we made a mistake. We
Put cups of salt
we
instead
thought
of
the
teaspoons.
salt was the sugar or something like that. And they're like, so then we just added a bunch more sugar. And I was like, you can't sell that. You can't sell it. You gotta start over. So they're like,
That's one.
This is like, to me at least, that is like a classic high school thing right there. Because they decide they're gonna do it, they know what they're doing,
Maybe
and
more
then
so high school.
they don't know what they're doing.
Not the girls, it's fine.
And a lot of it is the guys. But the girls do that too.
Yeah.
And I think you know, a lot of this is just, you gotta let them fail, just hopefully not in life-threatening manners. Right? But they do need to have meaningful responsibility, and I will say, so, when I was at St. Thomas, we started an assistant chaplain program with high school students. And by the end, we started with just like 4 or 5, and when I got there, like, no kid ever led prayer. I mean, it was like an act of Congress to get a kid to read at Mass. By the end of it, during COVID, we had 24 assistant chaplains, and because we couldn't all assemble and have morning prayer together, they would go in pairs to each of the classrooms in the morning and lead morning prayer. And they led liturgy of the word, assemblies for whole classes. They organized retreats. They gave presentations. They organized service time. By the end of it, they were telling me what I needed to do, reminding me of things, especially as they get into junior, senior year. Usually it's the girls, but some of the boys too, but some of those junior, senior girls, like I had all student sacristans. I would come in on the day we had Mass, and they'd have everything all ready. They scheduled all the ministers. They ran the liturgy. So high schoolers are very capable, and they want to be capable, but they need a lot of support and encouragement and mentoring. They need to be given that opportunity. Last thing, sorry. They also really like having serious discussion, meaningful discussions. Unlike middle schoolers who tend to devolve into fits of laughter about goofy things, and then they say something mean and somebody starts crying, that's middle school. But high school, they can actually they can have a meaningful discussion about a topic in faith, and they really get a lot out of it. So that's important for them to have that opportunity. And as Avery said too, like our textbook, Midwest Theological Forum, that textbook, I think I mentioned last time that like the textbook for religion with like this little thing with comics in it. So this is not that. And I think that's part of what it's really
Like, I think
robust.
you all would appreciate the textbook. Like, the adults that have read it, they're like, this is a great text. Like, it would be helpful for an adult level. They're challenging. And I think this year for the high school was understanding scripture. And it goes, like, they spent months on the Old Testament. And it's a pretty hefty book. Okay. Well, I think I'm just going to end on this last point. Because we have another session that I think me or Father Seamus is doing on lesson planning in group thing. I forget which one of us is doing. But because I think I'll end with this little thing about Don Bosco, and then it might be worthwhile to have just 10 minutes of discussion because we're getting closer to 8:30. Yeah, and I'll save this for the next time. But so as some of you might know St. John Bosco. Don Bosco, he led the oratory. He started the Salesians, and so he took kids that were poor or at that time considered delinquents. They had gotten into some trouble, and he was renowned for teaching them and forming them, and a bunch of them became priests and saints, and so he was just an excellent educator. And towards the end of his life, he wrote this letter to his Salesian sons. That's what he called them, his Salesian sons, as he was preparing to die. He was getting a little older, a little bit more sick, and he it was kind of like an exhortation to them. And he was in prayer one day, and he writes this to his brothers. And I think I can send this out to you guys at some point. I think next year I'll include it in the readings. But he talks about just some advice, and he was basically like, I was in prayer the other night, and I'm sick, and I don't know if I was just hallucinating because I wasn't feeling well, but I kind of my imagination started to run, and I was imagining you all and imagining some of the boys that I used to teach. And he kind of paints this scene of what he started to imagine in his prayer and kind of in being like almost asleep. And it was that, the Salesian brothers were there teaching, but all the boys were outside in the recreation yard, and the brothers were just like doing something else with their time, and then they came in and taught. And he was like, I was really disturbed by what I saw, because I think this is not how we are supposed to teach and form young people. And he said this, he said, if someone is only seen preaching from the pulpit, it will be said that he does his duty, neither more nor less. Whereas if he whispers a little word in recreation, this is seen as the word of a friend. How many conversions were brought about by those few words which you whispered suddenly in a boy's ear in the thick of games? So I thought that was a neat little thing of like, if you're seen in one dimension, and I think that's a benefit of having Father Seamus and clergy involved, and also just even to think of this as teachers too, if you go out to work with kids, to see someone in a one-dimensional way of teaching something, but then to see them in a way of them actually loving them, and that's how they're going to see it more. So he writes on a little bit, he said, and then he's kind of imagining this, that he tells the brother this, and the brother's like, well, I love them, I teach them, I dedicate all this time, I do so much for them behind the scene. And he said, well, do they know that they are loved? That is what opens hearts, and it opens an electric current between the teacher and the pupil. So it's kind of a beautiful thing of how to convey. Obviously, the basis, as he describes, of all education is charity, is love. And he's basically describes it really, you can't teach effectively without that, without them knowing that they're loved. And so I think that at each age, it's not as much about kind of development of children, but at each age, that's what they're looking for, because it's what humans are looking for too. So it builds a trust there that's like, okay, that's weighted. What they're teaching then in the classroom has a little bit more credibility to me, because I know that they care. They're not telling me something because they're forced to go through this book and babysit me. I think that's a big thing. And it's sometimes even a little bit of a stigma, I think, when people are asked to be catechists, and they're like, well, I did that for a number of years and I took care of the kids. And it's like, in many ways, it's like part of a vocation to, that's part of your ministry to the church then, if that's the role you're serving. It's not that you're a babysitter. And I think we're hopefully trying to build that more with our catechists and creating more of a community in that they see themselves. It's encouraging when you see catechists who are like coming to kids' sacraments and being involved in all of these other aspects. That's like, this is a ministry of forming and helping young Catholics live out their faith. And I think that's one other note too that I'll just end on, of sometimes we see like, oh, we need to teach these kids so much. And just to think like, these are young Catholics. They are Catholic just as much as we are. Well, if they're preparing to be fully initiated, then they reach a level of maturity. But they're part of the body of Christ and part of the faith. And so it's like how to draw upon what what we know in reality they're receiving sacramentally, and not separate the two. I know sometimes this becomes a challenge for people. They're like, oh, they don't know anything. I'm like, well, they are something. They are Catholics and they are children of God. So they're not starting from nothing, for sure. So we have 9 minutes. I don't know if we want to discuss anything, or do you have anything to add, Father?
No, I give it up to like